The social sciences, or more accurately sociology branches such as psychology, goes awry when it does things like applying the scientific method to people's survey responses and treating these responses as if they were an experiment, which is an error primarily because people's answers to a question are not consistent, like gravity or the chemical composition of iron. While metaphysics is entirely to be rejected as superstition, it is true that our brain's mental noise, such as our personal viewpoints, cannot be reliably subject to the scientific method due to the inconsistencies in our mental faculties. Even if we may think we are telling the truth, there's a host of reasons for why we may not actually be telling the truth, such as memory disorders preventing us from being able to perfectly recall things, and instead imagine new imaginary things to fill in the blanks as we strive to answer the questions we are asked. This is a common problem among psychologists who employ hypnosis as a means of investigation, as the hypnotized patient can be intentionally or accidentally guided by the psychologist to fabricate memories of events that never took place, or to twist their recollection of events. It should be kept in mind that while I criticize many aspects of sociological branches, I am not criticizing the whole of it, but rather certain practices currently common to it. I readily accept scientifically proven conclusions such as cognitive dissonance, a theory within psychology. This is because cognitive dissonance represents a phenomenon which is readily observable and can be reproduced, even if we do not yet fully understand the mechanisms for why cognitive dissonance happens. As I accept those things which can be proven scientifically, my criticism of current trends among sociologists is based on instances where they practice non-science and pretend that it is science. I'm not critical of instances when sociologists comply with the scientific method. Now, there are those who will argue that because the polling that is performed by sociologists employs mathematics, they therefore cannot be mistaken. The arguers will point to things such as election polling as an example of the accuracy of statistics, but these people do not truly understand what they speak of. In actuality, the American elections of 2008 and 2017 are examples of how election polling is very unreliable. The polls had predicted a landslide victory for John McCain in 2008, but it was Barack Obama who won. Likewise, the polls indicated Hillary Clinton would win the election of 2017, but Donald Trump won instead. The problem of political polling is that in most major elections in the USA, there is only one candidate for each party, and there are only two major political parties. This means the pollsters have a roughly 50% chance of being right or wrong to begin with, which are very good odds if you are a statistician seeking to make predictions. Flipping a coin, therefore, will be just as reliable an indicator on who will win an election as the so-called research performed by these pollsters. Certainly, if a sample size of a group is large enough, then it can be representative of the remainder, but this is not how polling is performed. Political polling is done with the belief that merely 800 to 1,000 people who are randomly selected by a phone dialing machine can determine the views of an entire nation of people. That is, surveying a small group of random people among the national population of 260 million people will result in getting a reliable answer for the millions of others who were not questioned, with only a 3% margin of error assumed. The problem is that this belief of how reliable the polling is done is based on nothing tangible. Statisticians have never actually surveyed the entire group of 260 million people to verify that the margin of error would be 3%. You may think that the outcome of the election can serve as a survey, but in practice, a fully accounting of votes rarely occurs because politicians tend to concede defeat on election night based on exit polling data, and a full account of the votes rarely occurs in U.S. elections because the counting process halts when one candidate concedes defeat. Worse, the statisticians often believe that just because one multiple-choice question might result in a 3% margin of error, that it must also apply to other unrelated questions when there is no evidence to suggest this. It is merely assumed. Consequently, the field of political science and how it employs statisticians is a pseudo-science that employs poor methods of measurement. This is why it's not a true science, and the predictions made using its methods are inaccurate. As said before, real science is reproducible. So-called political science is a kind of quackery fortune-telling that follows in the footsteps of predecessor pseudo-sciences that also relied heavily on data taken from questionnaires. A well-understood example of this is the field of human eugenics from the early 20th century. It is common today to view eugenics as having been entirely pseudo-scientific, but this is a mistake. Eugenics actually originated in the research by Charles Davenport at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories Station for Experimental Evolution on Animals and Plants. which resulted in breeding programs that developed chickens which lay more eggs and grow faster. This type of research would result in strains of protein-rich wheat and other such foods commonly purchased at grocery stores today. This eugenics research identified the gene and demonstrated Gregor Johann Mendel's beliefs about heredity to be largely true, insofar as it could be applied to organisms such as plants, and to some extent cattle and chickens. The problem with eugenics is the direction it went after Henry H. Goddard introduced pseudo-scientific ideas related to human heredity into the field. Namely, he blamed so-called feeble-mindedness genes as causing the problems in society such as crime, prostitution, and alcoholism, when in actuality it is more likely that alcoholism among pregnant mothers resulted in the birth defects that led to feeble-mindedness in the first place. While genetic defects often do get passed down among family hereditary bloodlines, people who do not possess genetic defects can and do become drug abusers, criminals, and alcoholics. The problem of alcoholism is not so much the genes a person has, but rather is in their individual moral character, and if the environment they live in rewards hedonism. With his eugenics research, Goddard employed terrible methods of gathering data. The collected family histories data depended entirely on witness statements with no attempt to verify accuracy of the information. The limits of questionnaires and polls were never considered. This resulted in pseudo-science and conclusions drawn from unreliable data. I point out now that the method by which eugenicists gathered information about human heredity employed the same method of sampling, interviewing, scoring, and scaling, and statistical analysis which is still used by most fields of sociology today, especially amongst those which label themselves as so-called behavioral sciences. These are the types of fields that political science belongs to. The eugenics methods of conducting research deeply influenced other branches of sociology, and so sadly these methods remain with us in forms nearly identical to those practiced by the misguided human eugenicists a century ago. The pseudo-science of Goddard influenced many bad social policies in the United States during the early 20th century, such as forced sterilization programs and restrictions on immigration from certain countries that Goddard deemed racially inferior. Based on his pseudo-scientific research, the eugenicists' pseudo-scientific intelligence tests and research on heredity were able to persuade the best of legal minds of their time to agree to sterilization laws, going as far as the Supreme Court in Buck v. Bell, which resulted in the Supreme Court agreeing to the forced sterilization of Carrie Buck for being feeble-minded, which took place under the state of Virginia's Eugenical Sterilization Act of 1924. By 1947, there had been approximately 12,000 forced sterilization operations on people deemed feeble-minded by numerous states working with eugenicists' doctors. A later researcher, Paul A. Lombardo, a professor of law at Georgia State University, found Carrie Buck and interviewed her before her death in 1982. He determined that she had actually been of normal intelligence and the evidence against her fabricated by eugenicists' social advocates in order to use her as a means to legalize forced sterilizations of ethnic groups they deemed racially inferior. These laws were not used only to sterilize populations viewed as undesirable. Sometimes they were used for other nefarious purposes, such as the betrayal of family members. An example is found in the case of Ann Cooper Hewitt, who sued her mother and surgeons in January 1939 for her mother having conspired with surgeons to sterilize Ann without her knowledge. Ann's mother, Marion Hewitt, had desired her daughter to be sterilized so that she could deny her daughter the inheritance of her late husband's estate. Ann's father had been Peter Cooper Hewitt, who invented and held the patent to the first mercury vapor lamp. Peter's will had designated that his daughter Anne would gain her inheritance of his estate upon having children, and if Anne did not have children, then the inheritance would instead go to her mother. As court proceedings revealed, Marion had a gambling addiction and sought to obtain her daughter's inheritance. When Anne was to undergo a surgery for an appendectomy, Marion paid the doctors to administer an intelligence test on her while she was waiting in the nurse's office before the surgery. As Marion was in great pain, she refused to answer most of the questions, and the doctors used these results to declare her feeble-minded, and then removed her fallopian tubes along with her appendix during the surgery. Marion insisted in her defense that she was trying to protect the public from the consequences of Anne becoming pregnant and giving birth to feeble-minded children, using the popular beliefs of eugenics to justify her cruel betrayal against her daughter so that she could obtain the fortune her late husband had bestowed to her. Sadly, the judge in the case determined that because Anne was a minor, her mother was allowed to have her sterilized, and so no criminal wrongdoing was found for the surgeons or her mother. The case serves as an example of how well-meaning laws that are rooted in pseudo-scientific beliefs can be used for more nefarious purposes than even what they were intended to do, tragically impacting the lives of others in unexpected ways. More commonly known among people today is that Nazis seized on this research for their own eugenics programs and justified their genocidal acts against other ethnic groups, claiming that their hatred was scientific. The Nazis performed approximately 400,000 forced sterilizations under the 1933 Law for Protection Against Genetically Defective Offspring, and later the deaths of 6 million Jewish people who were executed as part of the Holocaust. This is the danger of pseudoscience, for a pseudoscience is an ideology that masquerades as a science in order to lend credibility to itself and lead people into adopting an ideology that is objectively untrue. In the case of eugenics for humans, it was a form of scientific racism, which is to say that it was not scientific at all. Rather, it was men who purported to be scientists who used the perception of their research being scientific to justify their racism. Sadly, the kinds of poor fieldwork and data collecting employed by Goddard and his peers in the field of human eugenics at the start of the 20th century are still common today in sociology. And this is why much of sociological research is pseudoscientific as well. The results of most sociology research cannot be reproduced because the conclusions were based on faulty data. The reason this goes largely unnoticed is because eugenics was only discarded because of the horrors it caused in Nazi Germany. It was not abandoned because people thought the ideas themselves were necessarily non-scientific. This is why other fields of sociology have been able to continue to get away with using pseudoscientific approaches to the present day that I write this book. In my lifetime, sociologists produced another destructive ideology, that of critical race theory, which became popular. Yet critical race theory is just another form of scientific racism, as it relies on faulty reasoning and inaccurate methods of data collection. It also leans heavily on creative storytelling to mask that it is nothing more than Marxism, which has decided to treat human ethnicity as a social class, and like the pseudosciences that came before it, critical race theory unbalances society by encouraging people to be unnecessarily hostile to one another, and blame individuals for social problems they have nothing to do with purely based on the color of their skin, and justify horrible things in the name of social progress. These ideologies do not lead to the betterment of the human race as they claim to. They instead only lead humankind astray toward tribalism, pitting people unnecessarily against one another while solving none of the social issues they claim to want to address. Pseudoscience leads to monstrosities and must be guarded against. The best way to avoid becoming a victim of pseudoscientific ideas is to employ logic in your thinking. Become versed in genuine science and do not make allowances for the scientific method using special pleading fallacies. There is no such thing as a so-called soft science. There is only one kind of science, and it is the kind that adheres to the scientific method in its entirety. If a thing cannot be reliably measured, any research of that thing is not scientific. Consequently, the vast majority of those things which are sociological are pseudoscience, and they lead people astray from objectively understanding the world. This is why I have included this information in my book. The proliferation and popularity of pseudoscience is perhaps the greatest danger facing humanity in my time. We must stop sociology pseudoscience from continuing to be allowed to masquerade as science.